Was the Civil War about slavery? This is the second video in a multi-part video series discussing the causes and the origins of the Civil War. And if you're new to my channel, I am a scholar in antebellum slave law and slave codes. And what I do, for the most part, is I challenge and I combat neo-Confederates and Confederate worship, especially the resurgence of Confederate worship that we've seen in the last number of years, such as the wanting to glorify the Confederacy, the establishment of Confederate monuments and refusing to remove Confederate monuments, all of this that builds to this Confederate worship that we see coming out more and more today. And I told you in the last video, so you should go back and watch that, this is all on a playlist, that I actually agree with neo-Confederates, but for a very different reason. I agree that the Civil War, the war itself, was not about slavery. But I contend it wasn't about slavery because we were too racist for it to be about slavery. Both the North and the South, the slaveholding and non-slaveholding states, were too racist for a war to ever be fought over abolishing slavery. Now, the Civil War eventually became about the abolition of slavery, and we'll talk about that in one of these future videos. But the real problem was in the foundational white supremacy and the codification of slavery in the Constitution itself. And that is what truly led to the Southern states seceding. Secession of the Southern states was 100% about slavery and meant to preserve and protect the institution of African slavery and white supremacy in the slaveholding states. That secession is what provoked the actual physical war itself. So neo-Confederates are playing word games here. I'm making these videos to combat those word games so you can always point back that even if the war, the physical shooting back and forth itself, was not about slavery, the reason for the secession was, and that slavery's inclusion in the Constitution, America's original sin, was what brought us to that point. So the Southern states, and again, we'll talk about this, the slaveholding states in a future video, they said it themselves. They seceded to preserve and protect the institution of slavery. They said it in their secession declarations. They said it in the secession conventions that they had, and I'll use Louisiana as an example when we get to that video. They said it in their speeches. It was codified in the Constitution of the Confederate States of America itself. So here's the hard part for many of my viewers to actually understand. From a strictly legal perspective, the Confederate states, the Southern states that seceded, they weren't wrong about their right or their arguments against the North that caused them to secede, because the Constitution itself gave them cover to be angry and to secede. You should go back and watch my first video about how the states viewed state sovereignty and what will become this concept of secession. But because the Constitution itself was a morally bankrupt document that enshrined slavery at its core, it allowed the South to take what they thought was the legal high ground in this. The framers of the Constitution compromised human freedom in the name of unity. And by doing so, they guaranteed that the Union would always be haunted by this fact. The South's secession was about states' rights in the abstract. The states' right to secede, to follow their own path, which was the right to own human beings. And they believed that the right to own other human beings, specifically Africans and people of African descent, because the whole program was based on white supremacy, was their legal right, and the non-slaveholding states were impeding on this right. Therefore, they had the right to leave the Union to preserve and protect what they believed and what they knew, and in fact, they were legally right in declaring was their protected right. So the fact that I can sit here and say that slaveholding states were legally correct in declaring they had a legal right to own human beings shows you how morally bankrupt and perverted the Constitution actually was. It was the original problem. So to give you some background on why the slaveholding states were angry, how this built up, we got to go back again to the beginning. After the Constitution was ratified, there were two petitions to abolish slavery in the United States that were presented to the United States Congress in February of 1790. The Senate took no action on the petition. the House sent it to a select committee for review. The committee found that under the Constitution, not only was Congress prohibited from interfering in the slave trade, but the federal government had absolutely no constitutional authority to interfere in the internal regulations of particular states. And we talked about this. We said in the last video how many of the states refused to ratify without a Bill of Rights, but importantly, within the Bill of Rights, they demanded what would become the 10th Amendment. The 10th Amendment says that powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So understanding that, the states believe that whatever the Constitution explicitly delegated these sovereign powers to the federal government could do and could operate in those spheres. However, if the Constitution didn't say it, the federal government couldn't do it. So since the Constitution was silent on slavery, except for prohibiting the federal government from banning the slave trade until a particular time, then it was interpreted that the federal government had no other authority than banning the international slave trade. They had no other authority concerning slavery. Slavery was an issue to be dealt with internally, a domestic affair of the states. Now, in my state, Louisiana Supreme Court acknowledged the sole authority of the states to regulate slavery in two cases. One, in Gomez v. Bonneville, the Supreme Court of Louisiana said that, quote, slaves are, quote, mere passive beings who are disposed of according to the will of the different state legislatures, end quote. In another case, it held that, quote, the relation of owner and slave is, in the states of the Union, in which it has a legal existence, a creature of municipal law, end quote. So the Constitution further protected the right of property in human beings, in slaves, through the Fugitive Slave Clause. This clause, written into the Constitution itself, served as a guarantee of an individual's right to own slaves. And you have to understand that. Reading it clearly states that people have the right to own slaves because the clause stipulated that if a slave were to escape to a free state, that slave would not be free, right? And by the way, the Fugitive Slave Clause in the Constitution is a direct result of the Somerset decision. This idea of positive law being required to have slaves. If a slave escaped to a free state where there was no positive law for slavery, did that make them free? The Constitution clearly said no. So the slave would not attain freedom. He would be legally obligated to be returned to his owner. So this provision in the Constitution highlighted that the Constitution was and did have provision to protect the rights of slave owners at a national level, regardless of whether or not states had differing laws concerning the institution of slavery. So you can understand that if states tried to get around the fugitive slave law, or if states that had pro-abolition sentiment tried to convince the federal government to abolish slavery, the South would be irritated by this. The South would believe that they were violating the federal compact because the Constitution guaranteed and preserved and protected the right to own human beings, property, and slaves, and it guaranteed that if a slave were to escape to a free state, that state was obligated to send that person back into the state of slavery. So in 1850, California applied for admission as a free state. To facilitate California being admitted to the Union, because remember there was always this issue of a free state and a slave state and the balance of power in the federal government, the South was granted, in what was called the Compromise of 1850, a new federal fugitive slave law. And this was meant to help enforce the Fugitive Slave Act of the Fugitive Slave Clause of the Constitution. So there was now federal law to help implement returning fugitive slaves to their owners in the slaveholding states. Now, at first glance, you would think the South would have been very happy by this, and many were. But Jefferson Davis, who at the time was the senator from Mississippi, and who would go on to become the president of the Confederate States of America, he actually didn't like this. And he wrote about this in his, he wrote two books, The Rise of the Confederate Government, The Fall of the Confederate Government. And he wrote about how he wasn't a fan of this because he believed that it absolved the northern states, the non-slaveholding states, of their constitutional duty to return escaped slaves to their Southern masters. It was now putting enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Clause in the federal government as opposed to forcing the states, let's say, to do said thing. So he said that it was lifting their duty, their burden. Under the Fugitive Slave Clause of the Constitution, a non-slaveholding state was obligated to return a slave to his master. Now it was saying that, no, the enforcement of this is going to be done by the federal government now. So there's no need, COVID, so I'm still sucking down cough drops. There was no need for the federal government was now stepping in when he said, no, it's the state's obligation to return these slaves. So what ended up happening with this now Fugitive Slave Act was that many of the northern states started doing what, we talk about the southern states would end up doing, which came to secession. But there was an intermediary between, just following law and secession. You had Jefferson and you had Madison write the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions in the early Republic era. And both of these resolutions believed that the states were the ultimate arbiters of the Constitution. And if a state believed that a federal act or a federal law was unconstitutional, it was the duty of the state to interpose itself between the federal government and the people, or to nullify that law. And you saw this during the nullification crisis with South Carolina and the Tariff of Abominations, that this was something that was accepted or at least talked about by many people in the early Republic, of whether or not a state had the ability to nullify or to stand between the enforcement of a federal act that they believed to be unconstitutional. So, ironically, many of the northern states acted to nullify or to do whatever they could to prevent the enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. So many of these northern states, because, again, they were just as racist many times as the South, but just because they were racist didn't necessarily mean they believed in slavery. Many of these northern states were very pro-abolition, even if they were or did happen to be still very racist. So many of the northern states enacted these personal liberty laws. These were laws that served to limit the involvement, of the state officials in the enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act. So it was their way to try and hamper the implementation of the Fugitive Slave Act. Now, one of my favorite stories of an example of this, of the state just saying to the Fugitive Slave Act, is Wisconsin, and a story of a man named Sherman Booth. So Sherman Booth was actually arrested for violating the Fugitive Slave Act because he was helping fugitive slaves escape. A federal marshal arrested him, and since Wisconsin had no federal prisons, the marshal was forced to put him in a local Wisconsin jail. So Booth then requested and was granted a writ of habeas corpus from the Wisconsin Supreme Court on the grounds that the federal act was unconstitutional. So he petitioned the state Supreme Court. It's like, hey, they shouldn't be holding me here. Let me go. And they did. So they just released him. The state released him from this state jail, from this local Wisconsin jail. The federal marshal appealed the decision. It ended up in the Supreme Court of the United States. And to no one's surprise, the Supreme Court actually ordered that Booth be rearrested. Well, Booth was then tried and convicted in a federal court, but he was still put, after he was sentenced, he was still put in a Wisconsin jail. And immediately after, he was released again by an order of the Wisconsin Supreme Court. So Northern abolitionists and many non-slaveholding states were actively combating the fugitive slave laws. And for many Southern states, for many of these slaveholding states that would become the Confederacy, the Northern states' adoption of these personal liberty laws was seen not just as a challenge, but as a direct affront to their constitutional rights. Okay? And this is where things are going to get very bleak and very, hard to go through, especially, for those who look back in American history and want to look at the good things. You have to remember that central to the slaveholding states' argument and grievance here was the belief and the truth that the Constitution not only sanctioned their ownership of slaves, but also guaranteed the right of the return of escaped slaves. So I ask you here, who was legally right? Morally, of course, Northern abolitionists and nullification and doing everything they can to get in the way and to stop the Fugitive Slave Laws and Fugitive Slave Act. But the South, were they not legally right in their anger that the northern state was violating their end of the constitutional compact, which guaranteed slaveholding states' rights to own slaves? So this is where I say, yes, the bullets being fired at Fort Sumter, at Bull Run, at the beginning of the Civil War, had nothing to do with abolishing slavery. But the southern states seceding, the southern states leaving, which was the cause of the Civil War to keep the Union together, their reason for secession was because they believed the northern states and abolitionists were violating the Constitution, which, when you read it, guaranteed their right to own other human beings. That's why the Constitution, being morally bankrupt and slavery, America's original sin, took what could have been perhaps the greatest government, greatest republic in the history of mankind, and turned it into the disaster that we saw up until there's a great book called America's Second Founding, or the Second Founding, talking about how the 14th Amendment, which incorporated the Bill of Rights into the states, go watch my previous video talking about the Bill of Rights, and how it didn't apply to the state governments, that we really became a different country after that. But this idea that the Constitution protected the right to own human beings is there in black and white. And the northern states were not living up to their end of this obligation. So the northern defiance of the Constitution, of their obligations to return escaped slaves, to not interfere in a state's right to own slaves, was, by their overt nullification of the Fugitive Slave Act and the Fugitive Slave Clause, this growing sentiment among slave owners in the South, that's what pushed them to look into things like secession. Because if this is a contract among sovereign states and some members of the contract are not living up to their end, then we're going to leave, right? The Kansas-Nebraska Act is the next issue. This was in 1854. It established the territories of Kansas and Nebraska while simultaneously overturning the Missouri Compromise. Now, the Missouri Compromise would be declared unconstitutional anyway in 1857 in the Dred Scott decision, but the Missouri Compromise drew a line that said no slaveholding states could exist above that line. But the Supreme Court said that's unconstitutional because the federal government cannot determine whether or not a state has slaves. That is a domestic issue, a domestic affair of the states. Under the 10th Amendment, that should be controlled by the people of that sovereign state. So therefore, when a territory becomes a state, it's up to that people, that group of people, those citizens of that new state, to decide whether or not to allow or to prohibit slavery. So this act was actually pivotal in really speeding up the southern states' arguments for secession, because it was dealing with the issue of slavery in the new territories. So when it established the territories of Kansas and Nebraska, there was an interpretation by the slaveholding states that while the act creating these territories allowed settlers to establish their own institutions, their own forms of local government, all of these things, however, slavery could not be touched by the federal government in the territories. Only once those territories had enough people to become a state could they then vote on whether or not to prohibit or to allow slavery. Eventually, the settlers there would be able to make this decision. Prior to statehood, they could regulate their domestic institutions, but since the Constitution, the Bill of Rights prevented the federal government from doing things like depriving people of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And since the Constitution protected the right to own slaves, the right of property in human beings, the federal government had no right to limit the right of a slaveholder to bring their slave, their personal property, into that territory. And the territory itself, because it was owned communally by all of the states, it was under federal jurisdiction, could not prohibit the right to own slaves within those territorial boundaries. And that's where you see you had the Lincoln Douglas debates, and you had these arguments over squatter sovereignty is what the southern slaveholding states called it, where they said, oh, let popular sovereignty, let the people decide whether or not the territory can have slaves or not. And the southern states said you can't do that. Slavery is federally protected. And as long as these territories fall under the control of the federal government, slavery cannot be banned in those territories. Only when it became a state could the people then decide in their sovereign capacity to control those domestic affairs, one being slavery, to prohibit it or to allow it. So when the Republican Party started to become powerful, and one of their political party platforms, in 1860, was to limit and to stop the expansion of slavery into the territories, this signaled to the southern states, the slaveholding states, that the abolition of slavery was coming. And it was coming, and it was unconstitutional. The Republican Party, if they gained power, would overturn the Dred Scott decision, which talked about how states have complete control over domestic affairs of slavery, how the federal government could not regulate slavery in the territories because slavery was a protected species of property, how all of this was going to be an affront to their rights. So they obviously started getting nervous. They believed that the North and the abolitionists and the Republican Party were going to, in effect, violate their guaranteed constitutional rights, their rights to own other human beings. So here's really, I guess, the irony and the sad thing, is that the southern states, the slaveholding states, believed that they were the protectors of the Constitution. And they were the protectors of the Constitution because of slavery. And in reality, because of everything I've told you, they were correct, right? The Constitution being morally bankrupt and the original sin of slavery, the South, the slaveholding states, were legally correct because this country was founded on white supremacy, and that was ensconced, that was written into the Constitution. The northern states' nullification of the Fugitive Slave Act, which was seen by the southern states as a refusal to adhere to the Constitutional Compact, was one of those precipitating causes of Southern secession. Furthermore, the Republican Party gaining power with its platform and its ideological leanings was interpreted by many of the slaveholding states as an attempt to deprive the southern states, the slaveholding states, of their property rights in territory held jointly by all the states. So if you were a slave owner and you wanted to go to a territory, that was your property. And the federal government had no right to limit your property in those territories. So they saw that as, again, an affront and a violation of the Constitutional Compact. So this was all compounded also by this fear that the Republican Party, once they got power, or if they got power in the federal government, would eventually usurp power and use the federal government to abolish slavery, not only in the territories, but in the slaveholding states as well. So the southern states saw themselves as upholding their part of the constitutional agreement, while the North, according to them, was consistently acting in ways that violated this pact, right? If you look at the seal of the Confederate States of America, who's in the middle of the seal? George Washington. They believed that the slaveholding states were actually the inheritors of the Constitution, because they were. Because the Constitution being morally bankrupt and America's original sin, they saw themselves in the legal right. And if you really want to look at it, they were, which is the terrifying, scary thing that we have to acknowledge, that the Constitution was so morally bankrupt that it allowed for this to happen. So the narrative of the Republican Party, of the not allowing slaveholders to bring their slaves to the territories, of the Republican Party possibly coming to power and usurping power to the federal government to abolish slaves in the slaveholding states, when the federal government had already decided through the federal question that slavery was an issue solely for the states and only to be decided by the states. They solved this, and this grew to this feeling of alienation and the grievance from the southern slaveholding states that fueled this sentiment that their way of life was under imminent threat, their way of life being the slave society. And that set the stage for what they would eventually decide to do, which is secession, seceding because they believed their right to own slaves, human beings, was in jeopardy. So that'll be the end for lesson 2. But I did just want to point back that when Confederate sympathizers say the Civil War wasn't about slavery, you can say you're right, because we were too racist for it to be about slavery, because the North did not fire shots, at Bull Run, at subsequent battles, to end slavery. They did it to preserve the Union. It didn't become about slavery till later on in the war, again, which we'll talk about. But the reason the Southern states seceded was because their constitutionally protected right to own slaves was being violated, or they believed it was being violated, or they believed in the end it would be taken from them unconstitutionally. So it's not helping out the neo-Confederate cause that the Civil War isn't about slavery, because the white supremacist undertones, the fact that slavery was enshrined in the Constitution, the moral bankruptcy of the Constitution itself, is what eventually brought us to the Civil War. So as always, remember to like, subscribe, share, and I'll see you for the next video.